Hi, Cara.
Hello, Vanessa.
A super common question we get from people at every talk we give is, how do I handle it if my co-parent and I are not on the same page on a particular issue? And that particular issue, which we'll get into, could be any number of topics that parents deal with during the tween and teen years.
Yeah, I mean, it's so common that before we press record, we always decide who's going to start. And I'm like, I'll start. And you're like, I'll start because our lived experiences tell us there are a zillion ways in which you will see things differently from the person or people who are helping you to raise the kids in your life. And, even with my kids out the door, both in college, we still have conversations about all the places that not you and me, but my husband and I, but you and I too, all the places where we still don't see eye to eye on the advice we give or the way. Here's so much more than even the advice, the way we give advice, the tone we use, the word choice, the moment we choose. So there are so many examples of when co-parents or adults who are involved in a kid's life are not on the same page. And we're just going to spend a little time today going through a bunch of examples of conversations where there may be space for different people to have different opinions, or is often space, but how you navigate that. How do you manage keeping a kid safe and healthy while also disagreeing with another adult who is responsible for keeping that kid safe and healthy?
So there's tons of areas where this comes up, right? Sex, conversations about puberty, substance use, alcohol, drugs, nicotine, gaming and technology use, screen time, food choices, chores and responsibilities, expectations of a kid's role in the family, and then just the blanket issue of, as a kid becomes more independent and gaining more freedom, what is the path towards that end goal of an independent adult? How much are you willing to let go or not? So those are just some. I'm sure there's a million we haven't even thought about. Those are ones that come up a lot when we speak to folks. And I think it's helpful, Cara, if we start with a really common issue in this day and age where people who have children together come from different parts of the world, different cultures, different religions, different political views. They were raised in very different homes themselves. Like, there's a lot of varied starting points. This is not a world where we grew up in the same town, going to the same church, attending the same high school, living back in that same community where we were raised. There's so much more mobility for people. And in my own family, I grew up in New York. My husband grew up in Liverpool, England, and our upbringings were very, very different. And the perspectives we bring to all of these conversations, while overlapping in some ways, are also vastly different. You and Paul.
I'm laughing because, yeah, go for it. We grew up.
You guys grew up in LA, both of you.
Oh, yeah.
You raised your children in LA. You're
similar
surrounded.
Family, like similar everything, right?
Similar everything, which in this day and age can be very unusual.
And yet we're often not on the same page.
Perfect point.
Right. So let's start there. Let's go to the whys, the sort of underlying reasons why adults may not share the same approach or sensibility around a specific issue. And we'll start with cultural differences. And then we can get to the how do you transcend it, right? Because that's really the meat of the conversation. So I love how you framed that. This is a global world that we're living in. And there are so many upsides to that. But what it means is that people come together and they have different histories, different value systems. They come from places that might place different, they might frame growing up as, say, a boy versus a girl in different ways, have different standards. There are cultures that are openly talk about all the issues related to growing up physically, socially, emotionally. There are cultures that don't. There are individuals who talk a lot about it. There are individuals who don't. So we're going to stamp all of that as cultural differences, right? And here's the added layer that I think people don't often identify, which is you have to bring in also the cultural differences of the other adults in your world who are judging the way that you are choosing to raise your child. So there's this very visible component of my partner and I do or don't agree about X topic. And then there's the added, almost invisible, but very palpable layer of this other parent from school or my neighbor or my family member has a whole set of opinions that also factor into this. And all of those cultures can clash, and it makes it really hard. I mean, I think the first most fundamental thing when we're examining why this is an issue is the culture clash makes this challenging. And you feel, I mean, I don't know about you, Vanessa, but when I don't agree with my husband about something, I question it. I feel insecure about my choice, or I feel super sure and then overly confident, or I feel defensive. But it's like, it's never a smooth ride when you don't agree.
Right. I mean, and we are both in relationships where we are still co-parenting. We're still married to the person we co-parent with, and there's a whole other layer for folks who are co-parenting with people who they don't share a home with and maybe have new partners. And we'll get to that. I think when early on in our marriage, Roger and I thought a lot about what are sort of the most important things that we knew we weren't going to agree. I mean, he used to look at me, feed our toddlers and say, do you want peas or do you want carrots? And he grew up in a culture where no one gave you a goddamn choice. You took the peas. Even if you didn't like the peas, you choked them down until they were off your plate. And if you didn't, you sat at the dinner table for the rest of the evening until somehow those peas were gone. And he's watching me say, do you want peas or carrots? And he's like, what is happening here? Like, this is a child. And he didn't understand, the import at that time. And he will say this, if he was sitting on this podcast, he would say the exact same thing. He didn't understand the importance of giving kids agency, the importance of giving kids a sense of choice so that they go along with the process, the importance of helping kids build decision-making skills and problem-solving skills, right? At that point, he was just like, this is what I know. Kids don't get a choice, and you suck it up and you get on with it, because that's how he was raised. So in that case, he didn't agree with me, but I was home with our kids, and I was the one responsible for feeding them and dealing with 3 meals a day. And so he didn't really get that much of a say. And I think that's part of it. There are things that are sort of the purview. Certain parents are in charge of, like the youth sports or the dance. Some parents are in charge of the meal time. Some parents are in charge of, chores and household responsibilities. So sometimes it's a division of labor and one parent doesn't have a ton of a say. But there are other times, and this is an issue that has come up for years and still comes up for us, which is our family celebrates Shabbat dinner on Friday nights. And we both grew up, and you're going to laugh because it sounds so simple, but it's not. We both grew up where you had to be home for dinner on Friday nights, except in my family, this is relevant for like middle school kids, teenagers, young adults. You could go out after you had been home for Shabbat dinner, right? That was our weekly family dinner. Some people have it Sunday nights, some people have it Friday nights, whatever. In his family, you couldn't go out. You were home and you couldn't go out. It didn't matter how big the party was. It didn't matter what amazing concert was in town. It didn't matter if the person you were deeply in love with was only here for a week and then moving, across the world. It didn't matter. You didn't go out.
I get that. When I was in practice, granted, I cringe at some of the advice I gave because I was lacking first person experience when I was giving a lot of advice. I was like 12. But I used to say to families, whether it's a Friday night or a Saturday night, it's a really easy excuse to reduce the social challenges your kids are facing. If your kids are not about to make good decisions, and you know that, and that's creating stress and anxiety in your home, here's an easy one. You say, this is when we're doing family dinner. This is our family night. Friends can come over, but everything happens from this house. And you have just cut down by 50% the number of weekend nights when your kid is out of sight and making choices that you're worried about. So I understand sort of maybe what was behind Roger's parents' decision tree. Maybe that had nothing to do with it. And it was just,
by the way, he's a proponent of doing what his parents did.
Yeah,
so he
totally
knows the memory of missing out on stuff and really believes that Shabbat dinner is more important than sort of a compromise solution.
But it speaks to another one of these foundational why issues, which is personal history. So if you talk to an adult about why they're making a set of decisions, they may say, or, if they have a chance to think about it, they likely will say, either I experienced or I remember watching someone else experience this negative thing as a result of this behavior. So I was traumatized at, X event. I want to spare my kid from that. I watched friends, circle this very dangerous spiral of addiction. And I saw it happen because they were allowed to go wherever they want and do whatever they want. And I want to stop that. Like, there are all these bricks that contribute to this wall that adults build. And so many of them have to do with personal lived experience and personal history. And we are trying the best we can to protect our kids from reliving that. And how do we do it? We do it by running interference until they're old enough to make smart decisions. And on this podcast, we talk all the time about how the brain is not ready to make smart, consequential decisions until someone is 30. This is not to say that they should not be making independent decisions or be tested in independent social situations until they're 30. Of course not. Like, we have to gradually let kids go and flex that muscle and learn. But how you, as the adult in their life, decide to do that, how old they are, where you let them go, what you give them permission to do, is informed by all of these bits and pieces in your life. So, for instance, my family has a very long history of addiction in lots of corners. This informed the way I parented my kids as they were growing up and in a stage of life where there was a lot of access to various substances that I did not think they were ready to make the decision to. I didn't think their brains were there and that they were able to say, no, I'm good. Now, you know what's interesting about that, Vanessa? I was wrong. I was wrong. Why was I wrong? Because the family members who were informing my choices as an adult were also informing my kids' choices as kids. And one thing that I think we miss in this sort of who's on what page and who's driving the decision is that often the kids are well aware of the history that underlies a lot of parental decision making, and it's shaping their personal decision making as well.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we give kids enough credit. And by kids, I really mean sort of late middle school and into
that's
high school and college.
That's right.
As they individuate and as they develop metacognition of understanding their place in the world and also what's going on around them and the sort of decision making and dynamics, they really gain incredible insight into what's happening, not just with their parents, but their parents' entire family constellations, right? Their grandparents, their aunts and uncles, their parents' friends. I mean, there is an observance and an awareness that I think we don't give them credit for. And the challenge with sort of putting down firm, like, no, you can't go, or you can't go here, or you can't be out at this place, or whatever it is that if you go from 0 to 60, to your point earlier, Cara, they can't build the skills of independence. And to me, the friction is not in the black and white, can they or can't they? It's in what progression, at what levels do we begin to introduce them to independence? Do we begin to give them opportunities for decision making and problem solving? And one issue that we didn't talk about at the top, which is super relevant to this, is clothing choices, right? Like, what are they allowed to wear? We've done some episodes on this, on the tensions about the way kids dress these days and how adults feel about it, and all of those conversations. But being allowed to go to a party or a concert, when and how, these conversations are actually much more nuanced and much more in the gray area. And that's often where I feel like in my marriage, that's where the conversation, it's not the yes or no. It's the how long, or with whom, or what's our involvement, or, the sort of the nuance parts.
Right. And maybe the most meta way of framing it is there are some adults who were raised that kids have no say.
Right.
And it's all driven by adults. And there are others who were raised the opposite. And how we choose to raise kids is sometimes because of or in reaction to how we were raised. So Vanessa, we've talked about a lot of the foundational pieces that lead to why there might be conflict. But then there's the how do I handle it if there is conflict? What do I do when I'm not on the same page as my partner? And I want to frame this part of the conversation by acknowledging how much personality and style impacts whether or not there's conflict. Because at the most base level, there are people who are conflict avoidant, and there are people who are interested in engaging in the conflict. And when you don't necessarily agree with the person who's helping you raise a kid, so much hinges on how much you're both willing to acknowledge that and butt heads about it, right? Like, your conflict approach is one huge piece of how you manage it. So there's sort of conflict style. Then there's personalities involved: yours, the other adults, and the kids. 3 legs of the stool. And all you need is for one leg to be significantly shorter or longer than another, and your stool is totally off kilter, right? So there's that. Then there's sort of the social contract that exists between an adult and a kid. Where are secrets okay and not? Where do kids split adults? Meaning, I'm going to tell you this, and I'm not going to tell my other adult the same thing. And you and I now have a secret bond, right? Or I'm going to dump this on you, and I'm not going to dump it on that person. And you and I have that connection, right? So they're like, the how of the relationships really change the way that 2 adults navigate not being on the same page. And this is an important thing as we start to give some advice around them. What do you do?
Yeah. I mean, you've got all the different parenting styles. My new favorite is, I'll use the abbreviation of the profanity here, is F around and find out. That is my new favorite. I mean, just because of the name, but the one that, has gotten popularized recently, and I know there's a new book coming out on this, is lighthouse parenting, which is pretty interesting. But you've got helicopter and snowplow, you've got authoritarian, you've got authoritative, you've got permissive, right? You've got the whole don't ask, don't tell.
What's F around and find out? This is a new one.
It's basically like, you do your thing and find out what the consequences are. Right. It's essentially an embrace of the natural consequences of, bad decisions, breaking the rules, letting kids figure out how to manage their freedom by giving them kind of free rein and seeing what happens.
Yeah. I mean, let's just acknowledge that taken to its extreme, it becomes illegal to parent that way. I mean, literally,
and
it becomes,
kids become feral.
Yes. I mean, not always. There's like, if you, again, to the personality of the kid involved, if you're raising me, I'm never gonna test a limit, right? I'm never going to be, because why? Because of all the other personalities in history of my life. So like, it's not like I was born, knowing more. I was actually just born into a situation where I watched other people live like that.
Right.
I saw the consequences for them. And then I was like, oh, you don't need to put up baby gates for me. So we are all a product of our genetics and our environment. And this is so true, Vanessa. Like, there are all these parenting styles, and most co-parents don't have the same style.
No. I mean, 100%. By the way, my mom just told me a story that when I was a baby, before I was walking, I walked very late. She could literally put me at the top of the stairs and like go take care of something and come back, and I would still be sitting at the top of the stairs. So I'm not even going to ask you, pediatrician, what that says about me.
Oh, I wish I was a psychoanalyst right now.
I know
so much more about you.
It was just so, it was so funny. I did not know that.
Can you imagine? You're the fun one of us. It's crazy.
You would have gone into combat mode.
I would have crawled back into my crib.
Yeah. You would have like gone into the corner of a room without had an open door.
Oh my God.
And then shut the door. So I think, right, like most couples that complement each other have different, have different styles. And so that's really important. I want to talk about, what are some guiding principles of how to manage this, right? We've set the table. We've got everything out there, and now we're going to have a little meal. So
can I give the first one?
No, I'm going to go first.
See, we have different styles.
No, because you're going to take it, and I don't want you to take it.
Okay, you can have it.
So very early on, my husband and I decided, it's so funny to call him my husband. I never even call him my husband. He's just Raj, or like, hey, you. Like, I don't even refer to him as my husband.
The guy in the corner.
Literally, the guy in the corner on his laptop 20 hours a day. We decided very early on that we were going to be united front, that we were going to discuss decisions together, that we weren't going to argue about it in front of a kid. If we didn't agree with it, we were going to like take it offline and discuss it and come up with a decision, but that we were not to undermine each other in front of our kids.
I wasn't going to take that one.
Oh, good.
No. I was going to take a totally different one, but I think that's a really good strategy for people. And by the way, there's a lot of data that supports that strategy. This is not rocket science here. Kids exploit the weakness. They see it. This is meant as a compliment to kids, not as a diss on kids, but they look for the weakness. They look for where there's not a united front. And then that's the soft spot that they go for. And so...
Right. And I'm not going to pretend it's easy, because there are times when you have to make a decision in a moment and you're doing 18 things and you feel pressure to give your kid an answer, at which point we will say, one of us will say, I need 5 minutes. I got to talk to your mom or your dad. We've got to talk about it amongst each other. We will not be pressured. Like if you pressure us, the answer is no. You got to give us some time. We will check back with you.
Before I give mine, I want to ask a follow-up question to yours, which is, as your kids have gotten older, have you evolved that strategy?
No, I mean, it really has stayed of all the things that we do, that has stayed incredibly consistent. One thing that we never did in front of our kids, which I later learned is not great, is that we never ever argued about anything in front of our kids.
This is where I was going. Yeah.
And
this is where I was going.
That is a lesson that I have learned from the many wonderful psychologists we've had a chance to interview over the last several years, is like, your kids actually need to observe conflict. They need to see people have conflict, have resolution, and come out the other side. Because if they don't, then they live in fear of conflict and they don't know how to handle it.
They also know, and this is where I was going to go with it, they also know that you have different opinions and approaches. I mean,
yes,
I've lived in your house for probably a total of 2 or 3 weeks, right? All the time I've stayed over in your house. I know that you and Raj have different styles. This is not hard to figure out.
Also,
right?
because Roger has different styles from literally any other human being on the entire planet.
Raj, you are like a bonus husband for me.
One of a kind.
The best.
Yes.
But I think it's important, like this is not lost on our kids. So one of the things that has been interesting to me is Paul and I too had this united front approach, which when our kids were toddlers and grade school age and even middle school age was an incredibly important strategy for us, because our kids would seek out the weakness and try to then go silo one of us and break us down. And they were exceptionally good at it because they're kids. And as they got older, particularly into later high school, we got better at letting them know where we disagree. And we wouldn't fight in front of them, mostly because we're completely conflict avoidant, which is not a very good thing. And we just don't, both of us, we're lovers, not fighters, but that's its own problem. But really, what we would do, because our kids knew, is well, I think you should do this. And dad thinks, and I would say this in front of Paul, or Paul would say this in front of me. And, dad thinks you should do this. And we don't exactly agree on it, but here's why neither of us thinks you should do what you want to do, or neither of us agrees with the plan you have. And the thing that's been really interesting about that is it has, first of all, achieved what you just described, which is they can see that we don't always have to agree with everyone around us. And especially if you've got a pleaser, it is not the safest and healthiest way to grow up to want to please people all the time. And if you've got a pleaser and all you're modeling is everyone gets along all the time, that feels like a little bit of a toxic combination to me.
Right.
The other is that it makes room for really interesting conversation about the third opinion, which is the kid's opinion. Okay, well, you see it this way and you see it this way, but here's the reality, people. Here's what actually goes on in my life. And this is why I see it this way.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to get into that, because one of the phenomena that's happened since my kids have gotten older and they have this metacognition and they are understanding the dynamics between, their parents, and also between them and a single parent, one of the parents, and so on and so forth, is they often know what the answer is going to be. And so sometimes my kids will ask me to be able to do something or to go somewhere or something like that. I'll sort of torment myself, and Roger and I will have a conversation. We sort of turn ourselves inside out. And then we're like, no, this is a terrible idea. No. And if it's, by text or in person, we'll say, no, I'm sorry. And they're like, yeah, I figured you'd say no, but it was worth a shot. And then you're like, oh my God, I was just tormenting myself over my instinct that this was a bad idea. And they knew all along the answer should be no, but they were going to give it a shot. And I had a totally fascinating experience this past week where one of my kids was going to sleep over at a friend's. And amazing mother texted and said, "Hey, I heard your boys were planning on sleeping at my house. You need to know we are out of town. We are not home. He's home being watched by the neighbors. If I were you, I wouldn't let them sleep at my house, but I'm letting you know and giving you the choice." At which point, we all texted our sons and said, "Hey, we just found out, they're not home. You gotta come home. Like you're not sleeping over." When I picked up my kid, he was like, "Well, I don't know. It seemed okay." And I said, "It's not that you can never sleep out, but like, here are 3 things that came to mind when I found out there were no adults there. These are the reasons you are not old enough to handle this kind of situation. I'm not saying you never will be, but you're not mature enough to handle it, and it's for your safety." And then he kind of like got it, and we moved on.
By the way, that's the ultimate co-parenting, is when another parent flags you down and says, it's amazing.
Cara, I want to think about a few more sort of foundational principles that people can lean on as they're making these decisions and handling these situations.
Right to the how, right to the practical. So we've talked about not negotiating in front of them in order to create a unified front, which can be really important, certainly at younger ages, but even for older kids in certain situations. We've talked about where to give room for difference of opinion among the parents, which is important as they get older so that they can see different perspectives and they can also be part of the conversation. Another strategic thing that I lean on actually a lot is bringing in a third party to give objective advice. And this is really important because sometimes there are people who know better than you do. There are people who have either work experience or lived experience, where they can give you a piece of advice that is, it is mind blowing. And the big sort of asterisk I would put here is what doesn't work is when one of the two parents or one of the two adults in the equation seeks advice from a third party and then demands that advice from the third party is implemented. Like that usually doesn't go over super well. But there is a path through where you can say to your co-parent, listen, I'm really struggling with this one. I don't know what the right answer is. My head is going in 12 different directions. I am either going to seek help from, or I sought help from this person because this is what they do and this is the expertise they have. And then circle back with the advice and say, this is the advice I got. And either I think it's really horrible advice, which could be really bonding between you and your co-parent, or I think they're right. And this is why I think they're right. Now, I will add, if you are an anxious parent, or if you're particularly anxious on a certain topic, and you cast about and solicit advice from a whole group of people, or even from one person, sometimes it can help and sometimes it can amplify the anxiety.
Yeah. I mean, when we were first married and we were, having to make lots of decisions about what I now realize were not very important things, like,
but they felt huge.
Do you want Chinese or Italian for dinner? I mean, I don't know. And I would sort of second guess a lot of decisions I made because someone just gave me advice about this and now I'm changing my mind. And then they gave me advice about that. And now I'm going in another direction, to the point where Roger started calling me second guess Ness, because he's like, you just like make a decision and stick with it. And I think for kids, that can be important, that once you kind of come down, unless there's new information or the situation has changed or your kid has made a convincing argument as to why things should, like, once you kind of make a decision, you want to see it through and test it out and see how it goes and leave the door open if for some reason it needs to be changed. But to constantly be second guessing, renegotiating, reevaluating is exhausting for everyone involved.
Well, it's exhausting, but Vanessa, it's also important to acknowledge when something is not going right.
Yeah.
Right. So if
For sure.
you take a scenario where, so I'll give you a great example. And I've shared this story before, but I'm going to share it in this context now. First party I let Talia go to, right? Remember this story? I insisted what made me comfortable was parking in the neighborhood and just hanging out and being available when she was ready to be picked up. It was her first high school party. I had a lot of anxiety about it for a whole bunch of reasons, some of which were correct and some of which were incorrect. And what did I do wrong? I sat in my car parked too close to the party and I was reading off an iPad so you could see I was sitting in the car. And that was like the worst social faux pas ever. And it was.
Has she forgiven you yet?
We laugh about it now, but I don't think forgiveness has entered the equation. But so that was a joint decision by me and Paul that I totally drove, right?
Right.
Paul was like, I think she's good. And I said, I don't. And here are my 16 reasons why. We pre-negotiated it. This was the united front decision we came up with. It turned out to be not the right decision. Right? There were lots of other ways to go about it. And the most important piece of the equation in the end was for me to say, hey, it turned out to not be the right decision. Here's why I did it, but I think I need to adjust how I do it next time. So here's what I'm going to do differently next time. And here's Talia, what I need you to do differently next time. Of course, then COVID came and it shut the whole thing down.
Right.
And I
she
had a year and a half
party
respite.
again. Right.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, it's really important to own when it didn't matter who drove the decision. I mean, Paul was really generous and he did not throw me to the wolves and say it was your mother's idea to do that. And he could have. And I really appreciate that because when a partner does that,
right,
that's its own thing. And that's
right.
really
Throwing
hard.
each other under the bus is brutal. I want to point to another third-party resource that I have discovered more recently, which is older siblings.
Oh, yeah.
So sometimes now that my older kids are, really have a lot of experience and are really thoughtful, insightful human beings, when I'm grappling with a decision, I will ask them what they think I should do. And, not to give them the parenting responsibility, but more to glean their insight. And often they have thought of things I haven't considered. Often they have more information than I do about a situation and can, without, violating privacy, can give me some guidance on what I should do based on a bigger picture that they have. And also it shows them respect that you value their opinions and insights and that they are a valued member of the family. So that's another newer part with older kids that I've been using.
Two other specific outsource call outs. One, therapists, for obvious reasons. They're trained to help with a lot of these, but make sure you're seeking advice from someone who is credentialed and who is aligned with your value system or shares information with you in a way that makes sense to you. And then the other is grandparents. And I want to land on grandparents because grandparents, it could be its own episode for a whole host of reasons. But when we turn to our own parents or to the adults who have shaped our lives, there's a lot of there. There's a lot of wisdom that they have. They can really guide us in very beautiful and profound ways. And especially when they recognize in our children things that they experienced with us as children, it feels like they can kind of hold a mirror up for us and be really helpful. For all the times they do that, there are also the times when it's a little competitive with parenting. It's like, well, I did it better, or you could do it like I did it, and then you'd be doing it better, right? So there's that dynamic often. And it comes from a very human place. It's not to say that, this makes grandparents bad in any way, but it's like this weird underlying dynamic sometimes in a relationship that's like, well, if you just did it the way I did it, the kids would be fine because you turned out great or whatever it is, right? Then there's the layer of the direct grandparental influence, where sometimes kids have such a beautiful and strong relationship with a grandparent that they will mediate the parents disagreeing by throwing the grandparents into the mix. And this gets very complicated. And so I just want to acknowledge that if you think that personalities and temperament and situations and household structure and personal history and all that aren't enough for two parents and a kid, now you throw in another generation and all of those forces are bearing down. It can get kind of hairy and you're not all going to be on the same page. Just saying.
Right. And you have to draw boundaries that you are the parent and they are the grandparent. And while you value their love and care for your kid, that ultimately the decision is up to you, and how to do that respectfully and kindly while still maintaining a sense of connection to you and your child for that grandparent. That's hard. That's a really, really fine line to walk. But it's important that it's clear who is the ultimate decision maker. I want to close, Cara, with a really complicated aspect, which is divorce. And when there are different rules in different homes, how challenging that can be. We hear very often from parents who are co-parenting with another parent who lives in another home. Sometimes there are step parents involved, and that plays into, to your point, the more adults there are that have that say and sway, the more complex it can be. Also, sometimes the better it can be because there are more trusted adults for that kid. I want to point people to our episode with Sophie Jacoby Parisi, all about managing divorce and teens. She goes into great depth on this very issue and provides like a lot of, not just as a family lawyer, but also as a trained social worker. She provides really wonderful insights. The goal is the same as if you are parenting in the same house, which is that you are in communication with the person you are co-parenting with, that you are making decisions together as best you can, that you are on this issue a united front. But that's not always possible. Often it is not possible. It's a contentious relationship. Communication is difficult. You're just not in a place to do that, at which point drawing the boundaries and the rules for what happens in your home. And as you always say, Cara, giving the why and sort of being an effective guide for the rules in your household. It's really, really hard. And it's also really, really important.
Yeah. I mean, just a quick public service announcement from a kid whose parents did split up. And, I've taken care of so many children, tweens, teens, young adults who are in this situation. No two situations are the same. Some, as you said, Vanessa, for the better. There are lots of different family structures. And sometimes having families where there are two homes and there are more partners involved, sometimes more kids in the equation, these can be wonderful gifts. But it can also be complicated. And when we're asking for two people to be on the same page, 3 and 4 and 5 people being on the same page is really, really, really hard. And so, I loved that episode because it talked about how we can all do this dance. Even if this is not your reality, chances are, given the divorce rate, that you have a close friend or your kid has a close friend for whom this is their reality, and learning about it helps you empathize and helps you be a better friend.
So share with us some issues that have come up in your family that you're having trouble resolving. Because chances are if they come up once, they come up again, and you get a chance to take the do-over or choose a different path. And, maybe we can do a social media post on that. But let us know what else you want us to cover, or if you want us to go further on certain advice, because we didn't even talk about sex and contraception and all of those choices.
And having the party at your house. And if there are two houses, having the party at the other parent's house. I mean,
when no
Vanessa,
one's home.
This feels like there's going to be a part 2.
I think there is a part 2. Cara, Tell Paul I think he's doing a great job.
Tell Raj. Cheerio, mate.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.